Okay, so today we're going to be discussing the aquatic environments, which is mostly the ocean. Um, and the Earth itself is covered, almost three-fourths of it is covered by water 71%. 97% of that water is in our oceans. 2% is found in polar ice caps and glaciers. So this includes the Arctic and Antarctic ice caps. And less than 1% is freshwater, rivers, lakes, and groundwater. Yet, our terrestrial environment depends almost exclusively on this fresh water, whereas the most other aquatic environments, including the ocean, are not dependent on this fresh water. So water cycles through our different environments as is powered by energy from the sun. So the sun hits the water or other areas of the earth, and that heat causes water to evaporate. And it may evaporate straight from the ocean or from lakes and streams and rivers and such. It may also cause evaporation out of plants, which is pulling water out of the groundwater. But at any rate, it evaporates and then will precipitate as the water cools, as it rises. And then that water will, either go right back into the ocean or may create rivers, lakes, and streams on land. Some of it may also freeze and become part of the polar ice caps or glaciers. Eventually, though, water that goes on land comes back into the ocean, whether it goes through the groundwater or through rivers, lakes, and streams. They all end up eventually back to the lowest point, which is the ocean. Okay? And this is the figure from the book, similar to that previous figure, but also gives us actual numbers. So groundwater is 8,200,000 cubic kilometers. Oceans are 1.35 billion cubic kilometers, and ice is 27.5 million cubic kilometers. So most of it, of course, is in the oceans. Aquatic environments then are differentiated based on different things, including physical factors such as light, temperature, and the movements of water, but also the variations in chemical factors such as salinity and oxygen or carbon dioxide. Okay, and these we'll go over these in different detail, but one of the water movements which you hear about often in the news is whether it's an El Nino or La Nina year. And El Nino is caused by the warming of the ocean and the shifting of the currents to where this large pool of warm water is residing on the Central and South America side, which affects weather in North America, or if it cycles back over into the Australian and Indonesian side in the Indian, or basically Western and Eastern Pacific Ocean. Where that warm body of water resides affects the temperature and weather patterns for the years in which it does that. So water is relatively transparent to light, meaning you can see through it, but not as transparent, of course, as air. And that light will scatter depending on the color at different depths. And this also depends on the concentration of solutes in there. So in Hawaii, there's not a lot of rivers that are running into the ocean. So the ocean surrounding Hawaii and lots of other tropical places are very clear. And so you can see a lot further in the water column. Whereas in areas in the west coast like California, Oregon, the waters are murky because you have a lot of input from rivers, and that comes with the rivers comes a lot of sediments. It makes it very all these sediments, along with upwelling, will cause the ocean water to be a lot more murky. Red is the first color to fade out and be absorbed in water. And blue is the last, and that's why the ocean looks blue, because all these other colors are being absorbed while blue is being reflected. And if you look in coral reefs, which are very shallow for the most part, usually in very clear waters, you'll see pretty much all colors of the rainbow displayed in the organisms underneath. Whereas when you look at organisms in the deep sea, you see almost no color. In fact, if things aren't white or transparent, sometimes they are red, because red doesn't penetrate that deeply. So as far as any organism that can see down there that may have some light, if something is red or white, it looks pretty much the same. Okay, and so you have here a deep sea jellyfish, which is red, or this deep sea fish, which is almost completely transparent, which it doesn't matter because nothing can see it anyway, so there's really no point in creating pigment. Whereas if you look in these coral reefs, you see lots of different types of colors, because all the different colors in the spectrum of light can be seen. Temperature affects water, because cold water actually can hold more oxygen than warm water. And cold water generally has more minerals and nutrients. So this combination of minerals, nutrients, and oxygen usually makes cold water to be very productive. Okay? In addition, water, when it gets really cold, it will freeze. And water has this weird phenomenon where when it freezes, it actually becomes less dense. Most things are opposite. And as it does so, that ice will float to the top, and that can also affect then the organisms growing underneath, because it shades out the sun, creates this cold barrier which prevents temperature from warming further layers of the water. And thus, depending on the presence of ice or the temperature or the depth, you're going to have different amounts of light and these other factors, which are going to affect the organisms living there. The water movements and circulation, so these are can come in the form of waves, tides, currents, and gyres, which are large currents within the ocean, which is significantly driven by the wind patterns. And we discussed what causes the wind patterns are the convection cells and Coriolis effect upon the Earth. So those are the driving force in creating currents within the ocean as well. These are the major surface currents of the ocean. Okay, this is how water flows across the ocean, across the top. There are also deep currents as well. Okay, salinity, so how much salt basically is in the water. Generally, the ocean is 35 parts per thousand, but it can be less than that depending on whether you have a freshwater input or not. So near a river which is dumping into the ocean, you'll have a salinity of 15 to 25 parts per thousand. Other areas can be even higher, especially if they're cut off from any input of water. So places like the Great Salt Lake or the Dead Sea fluctuate depending on how much rain, but 50 to 270 parts per thousand in the Salt Lake, and the Dead Sea 337 parts per thousand. This increase in solutes also makes things more buoyant. So you can go to the Salt Lake or the Dead Sea and you can float really easily. Gases are as well very important, including oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen. Oxygen, of course, is what is needed to help organisms go through cellular respiration. And then the byproduct of that is carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide can also affect the acidity of the water. So it's very important there. And then, of course, depth is very important, and we talked about why you have different concentrations of light and temperature at different depths, but also oxygen content changes dramatically as you go further down. You have pressure, which will build as you go down, and that pressure affects the skeletons or internal structure of different organisms. And then circulation. So we had surface currents and we have deep currents, and those all affect the organisms and the amount of nutrients that are available. So we mentioned mixing before, but there are two phenomena: downwelling, where water sinks due to the changes in temperature and salinity, brings gases from the surface to the deep layers. So this can be very beneficial to the biodiversity of bottom layers. Upwelling is generally good because you have this cold, nutrient-rich water which goes up and meets at the surface where the sunlight is. And in this areas where upwelling occurs, you usually have very productive areas, lots of diversity, lots of biomass. And you can see areas of upwelling are highlighted in red on this map. Okay, and those areas usually are rich in fish and other aquatic organisms or marine organisms. Alright, so these are the different aquatic environments in which we will go over in class on Friday. So